Hi everyone, and welcome back to the āyU Academy YouTube channel. Today I want to talk a little bit about some of the basics. What does the word Ayurveda mean? And what different kinds of practices are out there today that work based on the science of Ayurvedic medicine? So I'm going to kind of take you through a little class, almost a little journey into this word Ayurveda. We're going to break it down in Sanskrit, understand what it means, what its roots are, and how we should understand it today. And then I want to talk a little bit about different types of Ayurveda. And I'm going to refer to this book, Modern and Global Ayurveda, which is a really fabulous resource. And I strongly recommend that if you are a student of Ayurveda, or if you want to know more about the history and development, especially up to the last 20 years or so, this is a really excellent book and you can find it on Amazon. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a quick screen share today actually, and walk you through some of the concepts and put them up here on the board so that it'll be a little easier to follow along. So let's start with the word Ayurveda. It's spelled A with a long bar over the top, Y-U-R-V-E-D-A. And it's made up of two terms in Sanskrit. The first one is the Ayur part, and the second is the Veda part. And so we actually have a split right here in the middle. So the term Ayur comes from originally āyus, and notice the different ending of the S on it. The second term stays as it is, and that is the term Veda. What you see here happening with the R and the V in the word Ayurveda is a special type of grammatical rule that is very specific to Sanskrit, and this is called a sandhi. And the word sandhi means joint. And when we use it in a grammatical sense, it allows us to join two words together and make their pronunciation come out more easily. So what we can do is we can follow all these rules, and there are literally hundreds of rules for sandhi that allow an ending like an S, or another variant of the same word is āyuḥ. And these endings get converted into the R. And so when we put this whole word together, Āyurveda, it's a little easier to pronounce that way rather than āyus or āyuḥ Veda. Notice that these two are much more cumbersome to pronounce if we were to add them together with Veda directly. So that's the whole concept behind sandhi. It is to make this pronunciation as smooth as possible. And when we get into advanced literature, we see exactly how beautiful and just refined this process is in classical literature. Now, when we bring the whole word together and we have āyus plus Veda, making Āyurveda, what we have is a final term that is ultimately the essence of both terms together. So what does each mean on its own? Let's look at that next. The word āyus or āyuḥ literally means life or lifespan. And the term Veda refers to knowledge. It has a much deeper meaning as well. It also can refer to any knowledge gained through scientific practices, meaning that these activities are observable, they are knowable, they are measurable, and predictable under certain inputs or within certain confined parameters. The term Veda also refers to 4 classical texts, or 4 of the oldest works that actually exist in the whole world, and these are the 4 Vedas of sort of original, they are the original Vedic literary works, and that's a little beyond the scope of today's discussion, so I'm not going to go there. But if you are familiar with Vedic history or Indian history, then you'll know that those are big topics. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're just going to stick to these sort of simplified meanings of Veda, referring to knowledge or science, meaning any knowledge which is knowable through scientific practices. And so when we combine these together, we get the understanding that Ayurveda is the knowledge or the science of life and or lifespan. So what Ayurveda gives us is this body of practical knowledge generated via foundational principles that essentially allow us to understand how life functions in the environment, in the world that we live in. And since this has been practiced for so many thousands of years, there's a lot to say in terms of how much time-tested knowledge is baked into Ayurveda because of the continuity of practice and the accumulation of knowledge and refinement and testing of all of these rules and principles. One important thing to note here is that Ayurveda has not necessarily changed in its fundamental principles over time. Those have pretty much stayed relatively the same, but Ayurveda has certainly grown over time, and it has branched out into areas and researched and developed very deep areas of knowledge based on these fundamental principles. A notable area of that is the practice of Rasa Shastra, which is the science of using metals and minerals for medicinal purpose. And so those procedures are very complex, and they produce very potent medicines that must be used under supervision. So when we look at practicing Ayurveda today, what we really see is that a lot of things, especially on the international level, can have the name Ayurveda attached to them, but we don't really know what that means. And so we'll see associated with this word Ayurveda things like modern Ayurveda, right? Or maybe global Ayurveda, or New Age Ayurveda. And these three concepts, or these three types of practices, are discussed at length in this wonderful book, Modern and Global Ayurveda. So I strongly recommend that you give this a read, and there'll be a link in the description below where you can check it out on Amazon. It should be a must for really all Ayurvedic students outside of India today. In addition to this, we sometimes see words associated with Ayurveda like classical Ayurveda or traditional, or even things like lineage-based. Rarely do we see the word science directly connected to the word Ayurveda, and I honestly don't know why that is, because the word Ayurveda itself means science. But there's been quite a lot of controversy, let's say, a lot of variability in this practice. So there's no one single standard necessarily. And traditionally in India, the practice of Ayurveda was maintained by, especially in South India, certain families that were lineages essentially. And so these two kind of go together. And they really operated based on classical literature. And so when we take all three of these together, we lean much more towards the sort of authentic side of Ayurveda, where we see things being practiced at a very complex level in India today. This also in India is related to what some like to call the Shuddha practices. And the word Shuddha in Sanskrit means clean or pure. And so this is kind of like the purest Ayurveda type that doesn't do anything else. Like Western medicine is not seen as beneficial to the practice of Shuddha Ayurveda, although that hopefully is also changing in India today. There's a really long sort of sordid history about how Ayurveda has developed into what it is in India today, and if you go through that book, Modern and Global Ayurveda, you'll start to get a sense of some of the pressures that they've been under and some of the challenges that they've had to face over really the last 100 years in trying to bring Ayurveda back to the point where it was maybe 1,000 years ago, when it was very, very well established. Now today, what we see more of is a drift, especially and even in India, into this sort of modernized practice where they use a lot of modern tools and technologies. And this is not a bad thing at all. This is actually a great thing, and this is how Ayurveda is going to stay current and continue to prove itself as a science, to be able to research and develop and advance itself using modern tools and technology. This is absolutely the way that it needs to go. And so modernizing Ayurveda is kind of a good thing. Global Ayurveda is this presence of Ayurveda that's now starting to take over the world. And as this happens, the quality and the integrity of Ayurveda starts to degrade little by little. Why? Because people who often travel outside of India, although they may have an excellent background, an excellent solid education in Ayurveda from India, they're now being challenged to apply Ayurveda in a place where it's totally new. And there's a lot of work that needs to go on in order to actually make that happen. There's a huge amount of discovery or observation that needs to take place in order to understand how to set the principles and set the rules for Ayurveda in different locations. For example, rules based around season and annual cycles being like the main things there. And then how does that ultimately influence the health of individuals who are born and raised and live in those environments? So global Ayurveda has a huge scope if it is done in a deeply scientific way with deep scientific inquiry. And so if we were to somehow, say, partner up with Western medicine experts who are very good at doing things like this observation, and work together with Ayurvedic experts who are also very excellent at their observational skills, I think a huge amount of information and understanding of how the external environment influences human health could be obtained through the practice of globalization with Ayurveda. The last subtype that I want to talk about here is New Age Ayurveda, and this is sort of a major drift that kind of pulls together things that want to seem credible, like making claims that New Age Ayurveda is based on some special lineage, or that it is based on some special traditional method, or that it is deeply embedded with spirituality. All of these things come tightly tied in with New Age Ayurveda, in addition to tight integration with yoga. These things, unfortunately, we don't see in classical literature, and the classical scientific practice of Ayurveda, it does include these things, but maybe not in the priority or the proportion that New Age Ayurveda makes it out to seem. Rather, instead, what Ayurveda has is a strong foundation in the physical. And this is about 60%. This is the physical manifestation of human life. And then there might be a good 30% on top of that, which is the mental and emotional proportion. And then the last sort of cream on the top of all of that, the 10%, or possibly even less for some, depending on where that person is in their own process of evolution, is the spiritual. And so in New Age Ayurveda, what has happened is that this entire thing has gotten turned upside down, and they claim that the spiritual is the foundation of life, and they miss, unfortunately, the actual grounded foundation of physical health that, in my opinion, must come first and must lay the proper foundation for one to then continue striving to achieve their highest state of being. So there's a lot of variety in the practice of Ayurveda out there, and I hope that this gives you just a really quick overview. I'd love to talk more about this as well. So if you do have any questions about these different types, or about maybe things that you have tried in your journey with Ayurveda, I would love to hear more about that. Go ahead, please, and let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you again. All right, take care. Bye.